Chapter 7 is called Don't Stop Till You Get Enough. Coke frantically pulled the t shirt over his head and angrily stuffed it into the garbage can. Stupid, 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 he muttered. How could we have been so stupid as to trust that lady? Mrs. Higgins is insane. She always has been. I should have known. I really thought she had changed, Pep said, as she put her Cubs shirt into the same trash can. She seemed so sad when she was talking about Dr. Warsaw. And she sounded so sincere when she was telling us how unhappy she was working as a paid assassin. Sincere? Coke sputtered. She played us for fools. Do you think she was really in love with Dr. Warsaw? Do you think she was really going to marry him? Pep asked. Or was that a lie too? Who knows? Coke replied. The two of them were made for each other. They're both psychos. The twins debated whether or not Mrs. Higgins could be working together with Archie Clone, but they were interrupted when Coke's cell phone rang. As expected, it was their dad. Are you kids okay? Dr. McDonald asked urgently. What did you say there? Or why did you say there was a bomb in the Cubs' dugout? Are you crazy? Yes, we're okay, Cook replied. I don't know why we said there was a bomb in the Cubs' dugout. Maybe we are crazy. Dr. McDonald instructed the twins to meet him at a parking lot on North Shenfield Avenue. He hung up abruptly. It took the twins a while to retrace their steps and find the location. When they did, their father was leaning against the side of the RV, hands on hips, never a good sign. If it was so important for you to leave the game early, you could have just said so, Dr. McDonald said sternly. You didn't have to have them evacuate the whole ballpark. That wasn't it, Dad, Pep replied. Really, we would never do something like that. Then why did you do it? Pep looked at her brother, who was always better in situations like this. Dad, he began, would you believe me if I said our health teacher, Mrs. Higgins, worked for the Cubs now, and she told us that singing the last line of Take Me Out to the Ball Game would trigger a bomb in the Cubs dugout. Dad, she put a gun to our heads and forced us to sing it. No, said Dr. McDonald, I wouldn't believe that. What if we told you it was a chocolate gun? Added Pep. That was a very dangerous stunt, their father scolded them. People could have been killed running for the exits like that. But if there really was a bomb in the Cubs dugout, Coke explained, people really would have been killed. But there was no bomb in the dugout, Dr. McDonald shouted. You did it for no reason at all. He shook his head and pinched the bridge of his nose between two fingers, which is what parents do for some reason when their kids do incomprehensible, dumb things. They climbed into the RV and headed downtown on Michigan Avenue, where Mrs. McDonald had arranged to meet them. She was waiting when they pulled over to the curb across the street from Millennium Park. So, how is the game? Mrs. McDonald said cheerfully as she climbed into the front seat with a shopping bag. None of them, not even Dr. McDonald, particularly wanted to go over what had happened at Wrigley Field. It was very exciting, Mom, Cope finally said. That must have been cool, seeing your names up on the video screen, Mrs. McDonald said. Was it fun singing Take Me Out to the Ball Game? That was my idea. It was a unique experience, Mom, Pep said diplomatically. Dr. McDonald shook his head slightly and snorted to himself as he put the RV into gear. The streets were busy, but he managed to merge onto Lakeshore Drive and the Chicago Skyway, Route 90. It was late afternoon by the time Mrs. McDonald punched their location into the GPS. She did some rough calculations in her head as they left Chicago. It was June 26th. They were about 700 miles from Washington, and they hoped to get there at least one day early to explore the capital before Aunt Judy's wedding on July 4th. So they had about 7 days to travel 700 miles, about 100 miles a day. That was reasonable. They were making good time, and Dr. McDonald relaxed a little behind the wheel, brainstorming about his next book. Maybe I should write a biography, he said to himself. I've never done a biography. I could write about a historical figure, maybe a president. People like to read biographies of presidents. Dr. and Mrs. McDonald were both thankful that up until this point they hadn't encountered any of the typical road trip calamities, lost wallets, mechanical failures, kids getting poison ivy, and so on. Little did they know that so far their children had been forced to jump off a cliff, locked in a burning school, pushed into a sandpit, thrown into a vat of spam, zapped with electric shocks, lowered into boiling oil, and chased through the streets of Chicago by angered Cub fans. Dr. McDonald knocked wood, well, the dashboard anyway, and reached into the glove compartment to put on a CD, Michael Jackson's Number Ones. There was there was little the whole family could agree on, especially when it came to music. But after Michael Jackson died, They had all gone to see his concert film. This is it. By the time the movie was over, the McDonalds had become Jackson fans. Four heads were bobbing together when the first notes to Don't Stop Till You Get Enough pumped out of the RV speakers. Oh, I almost forgot, Mrs. McDonald suddenly. I got you kids souvenirs. She opened her shopping bag and pulled out a Cub shirt for each of the twins. They immediately flipped them over to see if was any writing on the back. Thanks, Mom, Coke and Pep said together. I thought these would help you remember your day at Wrigley Field, Mrs. McDonald said. Oh, we'll remember our day at Wrigley Field, Pep said. I'm sure of that. They continued along Route 90 for a few minutes when, at the same time, all four spotted a sign at the side of the road. Welcome to Indiana, crossroads of America, Lincoln's boyhood home. Woohoo! Coke yelled. Hey, do you know that five vice presidents were born in India? How can you possibly know that, Pep asked Pep. I read it on the placemat in a restaurant when we were in Wyoming, Coke said. In fact, Indiana is nicknamed Mother of Vice Presidents. You're laboring under the misconception that anybody cares, Pep said. The McDonald's couldn't see it, but they were only a mile from Lake Michigan at this time. Billie Jean pumped out of the RV speakers as Dr. McDonald pulled off Route 90 at exit 14B. The sign said Gary. He drove a couple of miles through this busy working class city before the kids noticed they were no longer on the highway. What are we doing here? Coke asked. Did either of you know what Gary, Indiana is famous for? Asked Mrs. McDonald. I do, Pep said excitedly. She began to sing the old song from the Music Man that consists mainly of the words Gary, Indiana, repeated over and over again. If you don't believe me, YouTube it. Nope, that's not it, Dr. McDonald says as he turned onto a street filled with very small houses. Guess again. I give up, Coke said. The RV stopped in front of a simple little house with white siding and a dark shingled roof. Look at the street sign on the corner, Mrs. McDonald said. The sign said 2300 Jackson Street in one direction and Jackson Family Boulevard in the other. Beat It was pumping out of the RV speakers. This was Michael Jackson's house, Pep yelled. That's right, Mrs. McDonald said. It's his boyhood home. Only then did the kids notice a few stuffed animals and flowers that fans had left near the front door. Mrs. McDonald rolled down the window and snapped a few photos. Weren't there something like 10 brothers and sisters in the Jackson family? Coke asked. And they all lived in this tiny little house? 9, Mrs. McDonald said. The family moved to California when Michael was 11. Is this a museum or something? Pep asked. Can we go inside? No, somebody lives here, Dr. McDonald said. But this is like going to Graceland if you're an Elvis fan, Mrs. McDonald explained. Like going to Liverpool if you're a Beatles fan. Like going to Hoboken if you're a Sinatra fan. Hoboken? Coke asked. What's that? What's a Sinatra? Asked Pep. Forget it. They listened to Thriller as they headed back onto the highway just 10 miles east of Gary. They pulled into Yogi Bear's Jellystone Park Camp Resort in Portage, Indiana. Mrs. McDonald had called ahead on her cell phone and made a reservation. Dr. McDonald hooked the RV up to the camp's electric system while the others pitched in to prepare dinner, frozen chicken and vegetables. Afterward, there was a campfire going on, and the kids went over to toast some marshmallows. While they were sitting there, sticks in the fire, Cook was thinking about what had happened that day, and he suddenly remembered something. Back at Wrigley Field, right after their birthday message flashed up on the video screen, it had been replaced by another message. He had almost forgotten all about it, but his brain somehow had memorized the message itself. Pep ran back to the RV to get her notebook so they could write it down and figure it out. It looks like it might be some ancient picture language, Coke guessed, like something the Aztecs used or the Egyptians. Or each of those symbols might represent a letter of the alphabet, Pep said. Using the flickering light from the campfire, Pep puzzled over the strange symbols for a long time, while Coke toasted more marshmallows. He had no patience for ciphers or puzzles or any of that spy stuff his sister loved so much. There were 14 symbols, and numbers 1 and 10 were the same. None of the others were repeated. Pep turned it upside down and sideways, trying to get a different perspective on it. The dots had to be important, or they wouldn't be there. After a half hour or so, Pep called it quits. It was late. The fire was dying out, and it was getting hard to see the notebook. They were both tired. Most of the people staying at the campground had gone to sleep. She could work on it some more the next day.